After 11 years, they fired me by email. No warning, no meeting, just a cold, four-line message in my inbox at 6:42 a.m. on a Tuesday. Effective immediately, your employment with Caldor Energy is terminated. We appreciate your contributions. That was it. No signature, no phone call, not even a goodbye from the people I'd built their fortune for. My name's Ryan Mercer, 42, Senior Project Manager in the Acquisitions Division of Caldor Energy Partners. I'd been there since my late 20s, back when the company was 3 rented offices and a dream to become one of the biggest renewable energy players in the country. I'd led teams, closed billion-dollar deals, and personally negotiated the government contracts that kept them alive through 2 recessions. 11 years of my life compressed into a 4-line email. At first, I thought it was a mistake. My calendar was still full of calls, my ID still active. But by 9 a.m., my access to the internal server had vanished. My phone pinged once more, an automated HR message about exit formalities. That was the moment it sank in. It wasn't a glitch. It was a purge. I didn't respond, didn't forward the email to anyone. I just sat there in my kitchen, staring at the reflection of the morning light on my coffee mug, realizing how quiet the world can get when someone erases you. Then I opened my laptop, not out of panic, but habit. 11 years of work leaves fingerprints, files, contacts, structures, things you remember, even when they think you're gone. I found the internal documents for Project Helios, the $600 million solar acquisition we'd been working on for months. It was supposed to be Caldor's biggest deal yet, the one that would take them public. I'd been the architect behind it, the one who built every step of the negotiation. And now, they'd fired me days before signing. I read through the updated documents they'd left in the shared directory. They'd replaced me with a consultant, someone from corporate finance. I knew what that meant. They were cutting corners. I didn't need to sabotage anything. I just needed to wait. So I did. I waited, watched, and let them destroy themselves. Because sometimes silence is the loudest weapon you can use. 2 days after the email, the news broke internally. Caldor Energy was finalizing the $600 million Helios deal. Everyone at the company was celebrating. The CEO posted a polished message on LinkedIn about a new era of growth and innovation. My name wasn't mentioned once. Not that I expected it to be. That's the thing about corporate loyalty. It disappears the moment your usefulness ends. I didn't reply. I didn't post. I didn't even tell anyone I'd been fired. I just watched, observed, because I knew Helios better than anyone at Caldor. I'd been the one who designed the acquisition strategy, who built the relationships, who negotiated the regulatory compliance language that could make or break the deal. Without those details, the whole thing was a ticking bomb, and they didn't even know it. By Friday, I got a message from an old colleague, Megan, one of the junior analysts who'd worked under me for 3 years. She didn't know I'd been let go. She said things were moving fast and that the finance team had streamlined some of the compliance procedures to meet the closing deadline. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need to. I already knew what they'd cut. That night, I pulled up the draft versions of the deal I'd backed up before losing access. Every acquisition of that size required state-level environmental clearance and grid certification. We've been waiting on a final audit report from the Energy Commission, a report that was delayed because of a technical discrepancy in land permits. I'd told the executives it needed to be resolved before signing, or the deal could trigger penalties under federal law. They ignored me. Now they were pushing ahead anyway. That meant one thing. They were about to close a deal on land they didn't fully own the rights to. Saturday morning, I printed the old correspondence. Every timestamp, every memo. I didn't plan to expose them. Not yet. I just wanted a record of what I already knew would happen. Caldor was about to sign a $600 million contract built on an unverified foundation. And when that foundation cracked, it wouldn't be quiet. It would collapse in full view of the market. All I had to do was wait. And I was very good at waiting. By the following week, Caldor Energy officially announced the Helios acquisition. A $600 million victory, they called it. The CEO, Mitchell Vaughn, stood in front of cameras, shaking hands with investors, smiling like a man who thought the future was secured. But behind that grin, I could already see the fault lines forming. I'd spent years studying men like Mitchell. They mistake silence for surrender. They think if you don't fight back, You've accepted defeat. What they never understand is that silence can also mean preparation. The Helios project wasn't just a deal. It was a labyrinth of interlocking contracts, subsidies, and environmental permits. It worked like a domino chain. Remove one, the rest collapse. When I built the model, I made sure every step was documented, traceable, and dependent on verified data. If they bypassed even one verification point, the system would flag inconsistencies during the federal audit. That audit wasn't optional. It was scheduled automatically once the acquisition closed. On Wednesday, Megan reached out again. She sounded worried this time. She said the Helios site team had discovered unexpected land discrepancies, and that Mitchell was furious, blaming the operations department. I could almost picture the scene, the conference room, the fake composure cracking under pressure. She asked if I knew anything about it. I told her I couldn't comment. I wasn't part of the company anymore. Later that night, I reviewed the backup folder I'd saved months before. There it was, the original environmental compliance memo I'd written, complete with my signature and timestamp. It clearly stated the land ownership dispute that needed resolution before any legal closure. I had warned them, documented, formal, undeniable. Friday morning, Caldor's stock price spiked on the announcement. But by noon, an article appeared in a regional business journal. Energy Commission delays certification for Caldor Helios site. It didn't hit the mainstream yet, but I knew it was the first crack in the wall. I didn't send the article to anyone. I didn't need to. News spreads fastest in silence. The market would find it soon enough. That night, I sat on my porch, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The same lights powered by systems I used to help design. They had cut me out to make room for a bigger deal. But in doing so, they'd removed the only person who understood how fragile their empire really was. The first headlines appeared 10 days later. Caldor Energy faces regulatory complications over $600 million Helios deal. That was the polite version. Inside the article, buried under layers of business jargon, was the real story. The Federal Energy Commission had frozen the acquisition until ownership disputes and missing permits were resolved. In other words, the deal couldn't close. Not legally. I knew it would happen. The moment they bypassed my compliance model, they triggered an automated audit flag. It was the kind of thing you'd never notice unless you'd built the system yourself. I had. By Friday, Caldor's PR team was in full damage control mode. Mitchell released a statement calling it a minor procedural delay. Investors weren't convinced. Stock prices dipped 5% overnight. It wasn't catastrophic yet, but momentum was shifting. Quietly, inevitably. Megan messaged again. She said the office felt like a sinking ship. Executives were holding closed-door meetings. Lawyers were flying in from New York, and the finance team had been instructed to minimize public exposure. She wrote that some staff suspected sabotage. I smiled at that. They couldn't find a saboteur because there wasn't one. Just the absence of competence. That weekend, I drove out to the Helios site in Arizona. It wasn't far, 2 hours across the desert from where I lived. The solar field was half-built, rows of unfinished panels gleaming under the sun. The local contractors were restless. They hadn't been paid in weeks. I spoke to no one, just observed. The silence of an abandoned construction site has a particular sound. Hollow, metallic, final. Back home, I started organizing my files. Not to release them. Not yet. Just to have them ready. My entire career at Caldor was documented. Emails, reports, timestamped warnings. Every moment they'd ignored me was preserved in writing. By Monday, Caldor's internal memo leaked to a business outlet. Someone had tipped them off that the company might lose its government subsidy if certification wasn't cleared within 30 days. Without that funding, the deal would collapse. They had fired me to make the numbers look good before the acquisition. But the numbers were a mirage. The truth was buried in the paperwork they deleted, paperwork I still had. They'd taken my job, but they'd left me holding the detonator. And all I had to do was wait for them to pull the pin themselves. Within 2 weeks, Caldor's silence began to look like panic. The company had gone from daily press releases to complete blackout. No investor updates, no media appearances, nothing. That kind of silence isn't calm, it's fear wearing a suit. Then came the first real blow. A government report leaked online. Just a few pages, but enough to light a fuse. It confirmed that the Helios site had overlapping land claims between Caldor's subsidiary and a private land trust. The acquisition wasn't just delayed anymore. It was illegal until ownership could be resolved. That meant one thing. Caldor couldn't legally recognize Helios as an asset on their balance sheet. The deal that was supposed to make them worth billions was now a liability. I didn't share the report. I didn't need to. It was already spreading across industry forums, picked up by analysts, whispered in investor circles. I watched from my home office, surrounded by boxes of old documents I'd once buried under late nights and coffee cups. Every line in those files was proof that I'd warned them, that I tried to stop this. The irony was, they'd built the company's success on my precision, and now that same precision was dismantling them piece by piece. Megan called one evening. Her voice was tired, tense. She said Mitchell had fired 2 department heads and was blaming everyone except himself. She said legal teams were threatening to sue former employees for breach of confidentiality. I asked if they'd contacted me yet. She said not yet, but she was sure they would. I thanked her for the call, then sat in the dark for a long time after. It wasn't satisfaction I felt. It was inevitability. I told them this would happen if they rushed the deal. They thought I was being difficult. Now they were learning what difficult really looked like. By Friday, their stock had fallen another 20%. Shareholders were demanding answers. Analysts called the Helios deal a catastrophic miscalculation. And in the middle of it all, an anonymous source sent an encrypted email to the SEC, attaching internal memos showing Caldor executives had known about the land dispute months earlier. I didn't need to wonder who sent it. I already knew. Some truths don't need to be shouted. They just need to surface. And once they do, no one can bury them again. The SEC investigation made the headlines a week later. What had started as whispers in trade journals was now on every major financial site in the country. Caldor Energy under federal investigation for misrepresentation in $600 million deal. The stock tanked another 30% in 2 days. Investors were furious. Executives were vanishing from the website's leadership page like ghosts erased from history. I wasn't surprised. I'd seen it coming the day they fired me. When you build a system on arrogance, all it takes is one crack for the entire structure to implode. And the Helios deal wasn't a crack, it was a crater. Megan texted again, this time from a private number. She said the SEC had subpoenaed internal communications, and my old emails were part of the evidence chain. She sounded nervous, asked if I'd be willing to confirm my reports if contacted. I told her I would tell the truth. Nothing more, nothing less. The following morning, I received an official email from a federal investigator. They wanted to schedule an interview to discuss my involvement with Project Helios. The tone was professional, not accusatory. They already knew I wasn't the one who broke the law. I was the one who documented how it happened. During the interview, I kept my answers measured. No emotion, no speculation, just facts, dates, memos, versions, signatures. When they asked if I believe Caldor intentionally hid the ownership conflict, I said only this. I believe they ignored it because solving it would have delayed the announcement. And they needed the announcement more than the truth. The investigator nodded, wrote that down, and thanked me for my time. Afterward, I sat in my car for a long while. The city hummed around me, indifferent as always. 11 years of work, gone in an email. But now that same email had become the starting point of their unraveling. 2 weeks later, the news broke again. Caldor Energy's CEO, Mitchell Vaughn, had resigned effective immediately. The company had lost more than $600 million in shareholder value since the Helios deal froze. Lawsuits were piling up. I didn't celebrate. I didn't post. I didn't tell anyone. I just closed my laptop and let the silence settle back in. Because I didn't destroy Caldor Energy. They destroyed themselves. I simply made sure the world saw it happen. The collapse of Caldor Energy didn't happen overnight. It was slow, deliberate, like a structure losing its bolts one by one. First, the investors, then the clients, then the board itself. Within a month, the company that had once been valued at nearly $1 billion was now worth less than the equipment sitting in its warehouses. People began reaching out. Old colleagues, journalists, even rival executives. They all wanted the same thing, an explanation. They wanted to know how a deal that massive could disintegrate so completely. I didn't give interviews. I didn't share files. I just said the same line to anyone who asked. They fired the wrong person at the wrong time. Megan was one of the few who understood. She sent me an article from the Wall Street Journal, the headline bold and merciless. Caldor Energy's Helios collapse becomes case study in corporate negligence. The piece didn't mention me by name, but between the lines, I could see my fingerprints everywhere. The missing compliance report, the land dispute, the deleted internal warnings. Every failure they tried to hide had been something I'd documented long before they decided I was expendable. But the real twist came when I got a call from an unknown number. It was someone from the Energy Commission, the same agency that had halted the Helios certification. He said he'd read my report during the investigation and wanted to thank me for my thoroughness. That word stuck with me. Thoroughness. The same quality they'd once mocked me for. Too slow, too cautious, too detail-obsessed. Now, it was the reason they were gone and I was still standing. A week later, the SEC released its findings. Caldor had intentionally withheld environmental data to fast-track the Helios deal, misleading both investors and regulators. The penalty was massive, hundreds of millions in fines, frozen assets, and multiple executives facing charges for fraud. The number made headlines, $600 million. I read the report twice, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to feel the weight of it, the silence I'd kept, the patience I'd held, the quiet precision that had turned their greed into their undoing. That night, I stood outside, watching the city skyline. 11 years of noise had ended in one perfect stillness. And for the first time, I realized something. Destruction doesn't always come from chaos. Sometimes, it comes from silence, and the man willing to wait. After the SEC report, Caldor Energy's offices emptied like a sinking ship. The Denver headquarters that once housed hundreds of employees was down to a skeleton crew. Legal staff, compliance officers, and security guards watching over empty glass walls. Photos of award ceremonies and company retreats still hung in the lobby, relics of a confidence that had aged into arrogance. I didn't go there. I didn't need to. The collapse was complete. But part of me wanted to see how far the silence had spread. So one morning, I drove past the building. The company logo had already been removed from the front. Only a faint outline remained, ghost letters on polished stone. It was poetic in a way, a monument to hubris. That afternoon, Megan called. She sounded different, calmer, lighter. She said she'd left the company weeks earlier and joined a renewable startup in Austin. She wanted to thank me, though she wasn't sure what for. Maybe for showing her that sometimes walking away is the loudest statement you can make. I told her she didn't owe me anything. She'd just survived something most people never see up close. When I hung up, I thought about my 11 years at Caldor. All the late nights, the constant pressure, the endless metrics about efficiency and growth. They'd built a culture of noise, constant motion, constant urgency. But noise isn't progress. It's just a distraction. And the quieter I'd become, the more clearly I'd seen the cracks forming. That evening, I sat down and wrote one final note for myself. Not for the investigators, not for the media, just for me. I wrote, "They fired me by email." I replied with silence. The silence cost them $600 million. It wasn't pride. It was closure. Because what happened wasn't revenge, it was cause and effect. They had replaced diligence with shortcuts, trust with numbers, patience with greed. And I had simply let their choices run their course. The next day, I started consulting again. Small companies, honest ones. Businesses that wanted to build something real, not inflate their worth for headlines. They listened when I spoke. They took notes. They learned. And for the first time in over a decade, I realized the truth. You don't destroy corporations like Caldor. You outlast them. Quietly. Consistently. Until all that's left of their empire is an echo. Months passed. The headlines faded, replaced by new scandals, new stories. But every now and then, Caldor Energy's name resurfaced in the background. A case study, a warning, a footnote in a business ethics course. How not to handle growth. The cost of cutting corners. I never commented. I didn't need to. The world had already written the ending for me. I spent that time rebuilding, though not in the way I used to. My consulting work grew quickly. I didn't chase clients. They found me. Companies wanted someone who understood stability, not just profits. I worked quietly, methodically, choosing projects that actually meant something. Each one reminded me that competence doesn't need applause. It just needs purpose. One evening, while reviewing a new contract, I received an email from a familiar address. It was from Karen Holt, Caldor's former board chair. Her tone was formal, but the words carried a weight of exhaustion. She wrote that the board had finally reached a settlement with regulators. The company would be dissolved entirely, its remaining assets sold to pay off penalties. She ended the message with one sentence. "You were right about everything." I didn't reply. I just sat there, staring at the glow of the screen, feeling neither joy nor vindication, just stillness. Being right doesn't erase what was taken. It just makes you understand the price of being ignored. Later that night, I walked outside. The city was quiet, the streets almost empty. 11 years of noise, pressure, and ambition had led me here, to a life stripped down to the essentials. Work that mattered, a mind at peace, silence that no longer hurt. In the distance, I saw the faint reflection of light bouncing off glass towers, the kind Caldor used to occupy. I wondered how many people inside those buildings thought they were untouchable, how many were repeating the same mistakes in new suits. Then I realized something. You can't save people from the lessons they refuse to learn. You can only document the truth and wait for time to reveal it. I turned back toward home, the night air cool against my face, and thought to myself, some stories don't need revenge, just patience. And I've never been afraid to wait. A year after Caldor's collapse, I was invited to speak at a private business forum in Seattle. The invitation came from a venture capital firm that had followed my consulting work. They wanted me to discuss system integrity in corporate transitions. I almost declined. Talking about Caldor publicly felt like opening an old wound. But something in me said yes, not for recognition, but for clarity. The event was held in a quiet, glass-walled conference center overlooking the bay. No cameras, no press, just 24 executives in tailored suits pretending they weren't nervous. I stood at the front of the room with a single slide behind me. It was blank except for 6 words: systems fail where silence begins. I didn't tell them the Caldor story directly. I told them about human systems, how shortcuts multiply, how arrogance corrodes trust, how silence is never neutral. I explained how every ignored warning is a fuse waiting to be lit, and how destruction doesn't start with chaos. It starts with indifference. They listened closely, some nodding, others shifting in their seats. I could tell which ones understood, the ones who'd already seen it happen. Afterward, one of the younger executives approached me. He said my talk reminded him of something his father used to say, that the loudest people in the room are usually the most afraid. I smiled, told him his father was right, because I'd lived long enough to learn that real strength doesn't shout. It moves quietly, like gravity, constant, invisible, undeniable. That evening, I walked along the waterfront alone. The wind was sharp, the water dark and steady. I thought about the email that ended everything. 4 lines. No warning. No goodbye. 11 years erased in seconds. But it hadn't ended me. It had clarified me. Caldor's empire had fallen without me ever raising my voice. $600 million gone, not because of vengeance, but because truth doesn't bend. It only waits. As the waves broke against the pier, I felt something close to peace. Not triumph. Not closure. Just the quiet understanding that sometimes the best revenge is letting the truth speak in the silence you leave behind. And I had left plenty of silence. What would you have done in my place? If the story hit you, leave a like. And don't forget to subscribe. It only gets stronger from here.